What's happening, guys?
Before we get into the episode, we want to help you out.
In case you didn't know, when we're not gobbing off in Eddie's bar, we're actually online coaches.
We are indeed, and as a former Royal Marines commando, Harry spends his time helping people physically prepare for life in the military, and I can guarantee he'll get you through any arduous course you can throw at him. Isn't that right, Shep?
Bang on, Rex. And if you're tired of looking and feeling like shit, then let Eddie help you take back control of your life. He used to be a fat sack, and now he looks like a Greek god. That could be you.
If you want to transform how you look, perform, and feel, then get in contact with us.
The link will be in the description. All right, guys, and welcome to the 34th episode of Below the Bar.
Joining us on the podcast today is Ben Simons. Ben is a former professional bobsleigh athlete, two-time GB Olympian, and online coach.
In this conversation, expect to find out all about the world of bobsleigh, what it's like to compete at an Olympics, and how being a former professional athlete shapes his approach to online coaching.
Let's get into it. Right then, Ben, thank you for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. It's only down the road.
Yeah, welcome to the pod. Yeah, so fortunately, Ben only lives about half an hour away. We only found that out a few months ago. So, yeah, thanks for coming down. Basically, we wanted to start pretty abruptly and just think if you can give us a little bit of a kind of overview of the sport of bobsleigh, because a lot of people probably listening won't really know the kind of ins and outs of it. So could you give us a little bit of an overview of what's involved?
Yeah, of course. I think people are always surprised to know that actually, if you've watched Cool Runnings, you already know a lot about bobsleigh. I was surprised when I got into the sport of just how accurate that was. A lot of what's going on in Cool Runnings, them sitting in the sled, learning the corners, learning to push. Even when they're pushing that trolley down a hill in Jamaica, we have a similar setup in Bath.
Really?
And that's how I learned to push a sled, yeah. It's a little bit more technically advanced, but to be quite honest, it looks pretty similar.
Okay.
So, yeah, the basics are you've got a sled on skates, essentially, and a big ice track. There are many around the world. They're all very different. And you've got to push that sled as fast as you can at the start. And then your pilot has got to steer it then down the track fastest time possible.
Okay.
So you've got 4-man and 2-man. Those are the two events. And you have a new one now called Mono, which is a single-person event. That's only in the women's event at the moment. So that was basically to equal up because the women only had the 2-woman competition. They tried to introduce 4-woman, but it didn't take off. So to equal up the events in the Olympics, they introduced the Mono, so the single-woman. For the female category specifically, so that there's 2 events in the men's, 2-man and 4-man, and then 2 events in the women's, so the 1-woman and the 2-woman.
Cool. Okay. Was there any reason you think that the 4 didn't take off for the women's?
That's a really good question, actually. I'm really not sure. That was basically introduced, and it was meant to signify more equality in the sport, because actually the women's bobsleigh was quite late blooming with the same with a lot of sports. I think in track and field, 400 hurdles and triple jump weren't introduced for women until much later, because there was all these kind of old beliefs that the female reproductive system couldn't take the impact of triple jump, for example, kind of like old school beliefs that there was some fragility in women that obviously doesn't exist. And I think the same was in the sliding sports, so bobsleigh, skeleton, luge. There was a later uptake for the female sport. So I think it was 2002 was the first time that 2-woman bobsleigh was introduced to the Olympic Games themselves.
Okay, pretty recent.
So it's pretty recent. So I think probably it's just the uptake and the tradition and the amount of athletes coming into the sport, because obviously if you're going to double the participation of a sport like that, it's going to take a while. Because obviously it went from 2 women to 4 women, and there just weren't enough athletes to do it.
To span that.
And also the female pilots would have to, driving the 4-man sled or the 4-woman sled is very different to driving the 2-man sled. So the time it would have taken the pilots to develop, the female pilots, they would have had to have crews of 4 women that just didn't exist because there weren't enough women in the sport at the time. So what was actually happening initially when the 4-woman was introduced was that they were competing in the men's event with 3 men behind them in the sled. So there was a couple of really good female pilots, Kaylee Humphreys and Alana Mayers-Taylor. So they were from Canada in the US. And yeah, they were competing in men's races with 3 men in the sled behind them. but they were the only 2 pilots I think that actually did it. And then it was just, they just looked at it and thought, this isn't taking off. We're not going to get this through to the next games. So they bought the monobobbin, the single person sled for the women, just to kind of equal up the events at the Olympic Games.
So there's still 2 for both. Cool.
Yeah.
So which nations are kind of most into bobsleigh then? Because obviously it's quite an unknown sport in the UK, because we particularly don't have the facilities or the weather for it.
Yeah.
So like, who are the big hitters? Is it the nations you'd expect it to be, where there's a lot of snow and ice?
Yeah, so you've got your traditional like winter nations, the nations that do really well at the Winter Olympics, your Germany's, Canada's, USA, and then you have, it's probably, I would say, within the nation, it's probably biggest in Latvia. So Latvia is obviously quite a small nation, but they have a great tradition within bobsleigh. So I think back in the day when it was USSR, a lot of the Russian medals were coming from Latvian pilots. There was a track in Latvia, in Sigulda, which is near Riga. And then now that Latvia is independent, they've maintained that tradition, and they managed to funnel a lot of their best athletes into the sport. So you have a small country, but you have a lot of their talent within bobsleigh. So the Latvians do very well now as well. Germany are the powerhouse. They have the most tracks in the world, and they win the most medals. Switzerland, I think, was quite close on overall medals over every Olympics. Although Switzerland only has 1 track, which is Samaritz, which is probably it's the oldest track in the world, and it's where the sport was invented. Believe it or not, by Brits. So the sport
That's interesting.
Yeah, the sport's British. So
Another sport we invented
Yeah.
that we're now not a world leader in.
Yeah, exactly.
We
that.
invented every popular sport in the world or something near that. Yeah, it was British Army officers basically just trying to see how quickly they could slide down a slope on either tea trays or sleds that they were building.
That's very British, that, isn't
Yeah,
it?
yeah,
We're bored and we've got a tray and a hill.
Let's sledge. Yeah. It's quite big in the military, no?
Yeah,
In military circles.
Yeah, definitely. So especially in the UK, all over the world, there's a big military presence within it. I think the tradition in the UK with the military link is very strong. In fact, you know, most crews that have won Olympic medals have been predominantly military, going all the way back to the 60s. Because there's been a few medals over the years in the Olympic Games. I think there's the resources for one. Obviously, the military has a certain amount of money to be spending on sport. I think that's the adventure aspect. Obviously, the military want people to be able to go to mountain regions and do risky things, and there's a lot of stuff within it that takes precision and discipline. And so for a civilian like me coming in, it was really alien as an environment, because I was suddenly in a very military environment. Like even down to our coach was a Swiss coach, and the name of a certain type of corner on a track when he was teaching pilots, translated from Swiss German, was, I think they called it 0815, which means standard. And we were like, why does 0815 mean standard? And apparently it was a caliber within the German military.
Right,
So
okay.
the military, it goes so far back that they were even calling standard corners, naming them after calibers of weaponry and ammunition.
Yeah, because anecdotally, I have a few kind of my colleagues who went that route. I think one of them I know of, who's a GB athlete, I can't remember his name, but he's so he went from basically being a Marine to almost being a full-time athlete. So it's kind of, there is that link, and I sort of knew there's a bit of a deep presence there. Okay, so that paints a good picture of bobsleigh as a sport. So how do you get into it? How, if you take yourself back a little bit, how's your sort of initial journey into bobsleigh happen?
So I was always aware of it, and I was always a fan of winter sports. I skied since I was a child, and I was doing track and field at relatively high levels. I was at university. I was in Wales, and I was competing for Wales there in track and field. So I had half an eye on maybe a Commonwealth Games, but I'd had a lot of injuries and stuff, and I'd really lost some of the ambition to go a long way within that sport. Although I played multi-sports as a kid. And I realised there was a lot of talent ID that was going into the sliding sports, so that basically the sliding sports, bobsleigh and skeleton specifically, would hold talent ID testing days to try and test athletes for their speed, strength, power, and then funnel them into the sports. Also at the time, UK Sport were doing the same thing, and they still do that now. They have a few schemes. There was Power to Podium, Girls for Gold, where they basically go around the country and they set up tests for athletes to come and try. And from those, they'll funnel them into appropriate sports. So some of them were bobsleigh, skeleton, rowing, cycling, for example. And those schemes were going on as well. I just always thought that I'd looked at the possibility of doing bobsleigh years ago because I thought it would suit me down to the ground. I was a good accelerator, which is what you need. You need to be good at acceleration, probably more so than top end speed, which is the biggest factor within sprinting and track and field. Mm-hmm. But I just thought I'd be too small. So your typical bobslayer is about 105 kilograms.
Oh, okay.
In the men's sport.
As in small, as in weight-wise, not height?
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
cool.
So just didn't have enough bulk on me. So I looked at this and I think it just put me off straight off the bat. I thought, I can't really do this. I thought that maybe skeleton would be more appropriate. I remember when Amy Williams won the gold in Vancouver, I was looking at some TV program where she was training down in Bath, and I thought, well, maybe I could do a master's at University of Bath and give that a go because the push track is there. That didn't come around either, so I stayed in Cardiff to do my master's. But then what happened was British Bobsleigh came to my university campus to do a testing session, and I thought, well, why not give that a go? So I saw a poster basically in the reception saying, could you push your country in Olympic Games? And there was these 4 big guys jumping into a sled, and it showed the test. The tests were, I think, 30. It was a 45-meter sprint, standing long jump, and a squat and a bench press.
You were thinking that's
I thought that would just be fun to do. I thought
yeah.
I can probably set some pretty good times and standards on there.
That sounds great. You know, a lot of entry tests for like the military and stuff are stinking. It's like you've got to run run a certain distance in this amount of time. That's great.
You've got to sprint, jump, and bench. Sounds fantastic.
Just all output, all power.
Sounds good to me.
So I thought, I could. That looks fun, and I'd like to turn up and give that a go because of the competitor within me. And I didn't know whether much would come from it because of my stature. But then I thought there might be an off chance that maybe I could then kind of look at skeleton. If I did really well in these tests for bobsleigh, there might be a close enough link that they're like, well, you might be able to do that. Just because I was looking at skeleton athletes and they seem to be more of my stature. But I turned up for that testing day. I did really, really well. And Chris Woolley, who was the coach at the time, he looked at me and he said, right, yeah, come down to Bath to push. Obviously, there's always room for lighter people on the sled to a point, and you can put weight on. So that was always going to be the aim, was to put weight on off the bat. Went down to Bath a couple of weeks later, and so there's basically, it's like an X factor at this point. There's people getting cut at every point. So everyone turns up for the talent ID day. A certain amount make it through from their sprints, jumps, and lifts. Then you get to the push track in Bath, where it's basically a trolley on wheels with a timing system. You've got to push it on your own, and there's a cut-off point there as well. So I made that. And then that brought me through to kind of September, October time, where they do the full team push testing, where everybody pushes individually on that sled and gets ranked. And I was a high enough rank then to get onto ice and actually compete in the sport. And then 18 months later, I was lining up in Sochi at a Winter Olympics.
Oh wow, fucking that's a quick turnaround. That
That's meant. So you get to the end of this process, and they turn around and they say, right, you've made the cut or whatever. What happens then? Obviously, because is that a full-time job? Is it like still like a side hustle almost? Like, where does that stand? 'Cause obviously, you've got to make a living still and sustain yourself.
Yeah, well, it depends on where the sport is in its funding, because the sport is predominantly UK sport funded, so lottery funded, when it's doing well.
Sure.
If it's not doing so well, there isn't so much money. This is where the military thing comes in as well. So it's like peaks and troughs. There are periods when the sport's doing really well, and UK sport are all over it. Throw money into it, the athletes get a salary, the sport is funded, everything's paid for. And then one result that isn't quite good enough, because basically it's tough. They'll ask you for a certain result at first, like a top 10 to get funding. The next year it's got to be a top 5. By the Olympics it's got to be a medal. So it keeps getting harder and harder to maintain your funding. So eventually it drops off. So when it drops off, it goes completely back to military by and large, because the military athletes, the military can fund some of the sliding, some of the sleds, some of the transport, and a lot of the military athletes can get time off military work to actually go and compete. And then usually it'll be a team of those guys that will get another good result. Money will come back in from UK Sport. So when I came in, I was in the perfect time really to come in, because it was transitioning back into UK Sport funding. So it meant my first season was completely covered financially, so I could travel and obviously have accommodation and compete without spending any money. But I wasn't earning any money from the sport at that point, so I'd have to go home and work. I had to go back home that summer and work. So it wasn't until after my first Winter Olympic Games in Sochi that I actually got UK Sport funding. And then I maintained that for about 5 years, I think.
And is that them supporting you as an individual, not just your sport, so to speak? Right, okay.
Yeah, so you then get that money individually as a grant into your bank account.
So you're already 18 months into, and you've done Olympic Games before you get a first kind of salary from UK Sport. Is that right?
For me, that was the case. It's a different journey for everybody, though, because after that, there was a big injection of funding into the sport, because some of the results we'd got were really, really good. So all of this funding came into the sport, and a certain amount of slots would open up for an APA, which is an Athlete Personal Award, which is the grant that I'm talking about. So suddenly a load of slots open up, and then you get everybody and their dog coming in from track and field, some rugby, from different sports, literally because they've heard there are funding places open. Come in and test. A lot of the initial tests were just physical tests, so speed, strength and power, and people were being given Athlete Personal Awards straight off the bat before even getting onto the ice. So it was completely different then to my entry to the sport. But then after a couple of bad results, that all dries up, and then you're back to square one where I was when I started.
Seems like a pretty turbulent sort of process, right? So you sometimes getting funding, sometimes you're getting salaries, and then you get a bad result and it drops off.
Absolutely, yeah. It's always on a knife edge.
Yeah.
Like mentally, as an athlete, that must be hard, because obviously you're preparing for an Olympic Games, and you kind of you've got like strict routine, going through the motions almost. But then in the back of your mind, you're like, have I got enough money to kind of like pay bills and put food on the table here? Like, it's not the kind of environment you want to foster to produce kind of like podium finishes, really, is it? Like when you can't sustain your own athletes because of like funding issues and stuff.
That's always the trouble when the funding isn't there. So when UK Sport aren't involved and funding the program and funding the athletes, obviously the money's got to come from elsewhere. There's a big military presence, so that helps. But then a lot of the time, those military athletes, pilots especially, still have to drum up their own support and sponsorship to make more money to be able to buy equipment, pay for flights, pay for accommodation. So there's a lot of private sponsorship that comes in at that point as well. So what happened was after 2018, so after the Pyeongchang Olympics, UK Sport pulled out. So we did the last 4 years leading into Beijing, self-funded. So at that point, the pilots at the time did a great job of finding private sponsors, which kept the sport afloat. So they all found private sponsors that were putting, in total, probably, over £1 million into the program for the next 4 years. So, hats off to the pilots and everybody that got involved in that process after UK Sport pulled out, because then the sport could have just literally sank. Whereas they reached out, they found personal sponsors, and these personal sponsors actually gave them enough money to go around and compete and even buy some of the best equipment in the world. So these sponsors were able to come through with enough funds to buy absolutely top tier equipment. What it did mean, though, they weren't prepared to go far enough to salary the athletes. So the athletes still had to support themselves living wise, but obviously everything was paid for when they were away. So for me personally, that meant I actually started my online business because of that. I was almost forced into the online training sphere, because also I needed to be able to do something that I could do while I was away.
Remotely,
it had to be remote.
Yeah.
So I was already in the area before COVID. So peaks and troughs. It was a little bit of an advantage there for me, because I was forced into actually starting an online business, which was something that I had when I retired last year to fall back on.
That's huge. I think. Do you know if it's the same in other countries, as in like in more leading countries, like you say, America, Canada, whatever? Is the process the same as in the athletes get more support there? Is it a different process?
It's different in different countries. So people are always surprised. The US is a tough country for their Olympic athletes, even though they're the most successful Olympic nation. A lot of that, I think, is because of their collegiate system. So a lot of the athletes there are supported because they've got collegiate scholarships.
Yeah.
Whereas their actual government funding, they don't have the equivalent of a national lottery funding in the US. Canada does. They have something called Can Fund, which I don't know where the pot of money comes from, but they support their Olympic athletes. Germany, I think Germany does have a kind of overreaching government funding model, but a lot of their athletes are still in the military or in the police.
Right.
Same in Italy. A lot of the athletes are police or carabinieri, and in a lot of other nations, I don't know exactly how it works. I think Russia is heavily government funded, so they're all right.
Yeah, I would imagine the more you can take off the athlete's plate in every other part of their life, the better performance you're gonna fucking get from them, right?
Absolutely.
So if you've got to worry about your online business,
Yeah.
it's like, well, there's a bit of a,
Well, that's time and energy that you're now not allocating to your sport, isn't it?
yeah, and your primary role at that point in your life is to be the fucking best at that sport you can possibly be, and you can't really do that if you've got to divert your attention.
Yeah, part-time training equals part-time results.
Yeah,
and
100%.
if you're working, you have to be part-time, because it's ironic, really. There was enough hours in the day when I was training full-time that I could have put into some sort of side hustle, but because I was so involved in training, I didn't have any energy to do anything outside of that, because I put 100% into that training process.
And that's what it requires, right?
And it does, yeah. And that really was a dream for me. I got to live out my ultimate dream, which was, to be honest, being a full-time athlete. All I wanted to worry about was training and my own physical performance. So for 5-6 years, I was able to do that, thankfully with the help of UK Sport. And that really was a dream. And through that, I reached levels of physical performance that I honestly didn't feel I was capable of. I literally went above and beyond the limits that I thought were set for me. I
and
got
that's
through the ceiling.
I mean, that's by virtue of being able to push 100% into everything.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what, on like a day-to-day or a weekly basis, when you're leading up to an Olympics, what's your kind of, as an athlete, your day-to-day look like? What's how many hours you're training? What's that going to look like?
So for us, it was kind of divided up into summer and winter training.
Mm-hmm.
So winter was always in competition, because the bobsleigh circuit is a bit like an F1 circuit. You go from place to place, week to week, and you do a World Cup race in every place. So you start off in North America, might do Canada, US, back over to Europe, go around Europe. So you're just dotting around doing these events. So it's harder to get a good amount of training in while you're out on season, and also you've got to stay relatively fresh because you're trying to get results at every World Cup race. The summer is completely different, and the other thing is, in the winter you're a team, in the summer you're an individual, because you're competing against the other guys in your team to be the best individual push athlete. And then come winter, you get put in a team with those guys, and you've got to gel as a crew. So that's another issue that sometimes comes up. So summer, I'd always be based down in Bath full time, because that's where the push track is. And typical week would be 6 training days, and I'd take Sunday off. Your typical day would be, I'd get up, have breakfast, get into the training centre for about 10 o'clock. So it'd usually be like warm-up starts at 10. So you'd get into the training centre. This was at Bath University, indoor running track, start warming up, get on the physio bed, get straightened out, checked over. By 11 to half 11, we were over at the push track to do some push training. Push training would usually last for about an hour, get some lunch, then we'd have our S&C in the afternoon, go and do our S&C. After that, we may have some more physiotherapy or some hydrotherapy, so we might get in the pool, do some recovery modalities. That would be the setup for probably about 4 days of the week, and then the other days might just be gym based or just be track based. But all in all, you're probably training with warm-ups for 3 to 4 hours a day, and then physiotherapy and recovery modalities be another hour or two. Yeah, It was a full day. I'd
It's
go
a
into
it's like a full-time job.
yeah. I'd go into the training centre at just before 10, and I'd usually be out for about 4:30. Yeah,
Fucking hell.
yeah. So it was full on, and that was 5-6 days a week really.
So and does that ramp up leading to an Olympic game? So it just basically gets more and more intense as you go towards the actual event.
So it kind of changes there in that what will happen then is, so the Olympics will be in February, and the example I just gave would have been in the height of summer, so kind of July, August, when you're trying to be the best athlete you can be so you can make the team or be at the highest position in the team. And then come October, we'd go on to the ice, start doing team training. And then from end of October, November, all the way through to the Olympic Games, there would be World Cup competitions. So a lot of the time you'd be qualifying for the Olympics during that World Cup season as well. Then you'd have a little bit of a break before the Olympic Games, which would involve a holding camp. So you'd be in a certain place for a week or two, just training up, ramping up for the Olympic Games. That becomes really difficult, and that's where a lot of mistakes are made, because you've gone for this really intense summer, and you've gone onto the ice to compete, and you've had this competition period where you can't train a lot because you don't want to be fatigued for competition. And then right before the games, you have this little period where you can get some work in, and it's really easy to go overboard and overtrain yourself before you go into Olympic Games. So a lot of the work there would be more technical, and you're trying to get the teamship really, really honed in. So a lot of the time it would be team push-in, would be somewhere where there was the ability to push, to actually be near a track, to do some actual sliding down the track. And so that would really be how the training ramped up before to the games. So it was kind of a weird one in that it didn't necessarily get more intense. And if it did, it was sometimes a mistake. There was, I saw people go into certainly World Championships and some Olympic Games a little bit fatigued.
Yeah, because certainly with like a super explosive high output thing, if your CNS is slightly dampened, you're not going to perform. So are all those sessions coach led all the time, or are some of them individual? How's that look like?
So they were mostly coach led, almost always coach led. So we were very lucky when we were fully UK Sport funded that at every session we would have maybe two coaches and a physio, sometimes maybe two physios. So there might be 4 support staff sometimes for the team when they're training. So we were very lucky with that. Even the gym sessions, the S&C coach would be in there with us. For me, I had a little bit more of an input into my own program because the coaches were really good. They trusted that I had quite a lot of knowledge in the area and kind of knew my own body. So I did things slightly different to some of the other guys. And so there was a couple of sessions that I might do unattended during the week. By and large, everybody else was supervised when they were doing all of their training.
Yeah, we haven't covered Ben's education yet, but we will do.
Well, when you talk about individuals in the team, so kind of like pre-Olympics, how many guys are you training with day to day? And then when is the actual Olympic team announced, and how does that affect your relationship with individuals? Because obviously some people are going to be elated, other people are going to be disappointed. Like, is there a friction, or is it just par for the course almost? Like that's...
Yeah, that's a crazy experience. It's really hard to describe because it's always bubbling under the surface.
It's like the elephant in the room, I guess.
A lot of the time, yeah. And usually we're trying to qualify 2 4-man teams for the Olympics. And sometimes what happens is the teams are being swapped around during the season to try and find like the perfect cohesive group. That can be super frustrating when you're individually ranked very high. And luckily for myself, I was always individually ranked very high on the single man push. But sometimes cohesively, it just doesn't quite happen. And the coaches will have their own ideas as to what the best team is. So you might be dropped, cut, switched onto other teams, changed around, which is always quite frustrating. Some teams kind of gel early and are kept together, almost ring-fenced and protected, just because they know they compete so well together. I was kind of never part of one of those teams for whatever reason, just the time I came into the sport. I spent time doing pilot training as well. So for a couple of years, I did quite a lot of training to actually pilot a sled, drive the sled, because they were kind of building me up to be a pilot in the future. So I dropped out of actually being a brakeman, one of the push athletes, for a few races. So there's a lot of chopping and changing that goes on. And yeah, it's a very, very tough process, because then the Olympic team isn't usually announced until literally right before the games. So the teams for the season leading into the Olympics will be announced in like October, and then you'll go and compete, and then teams might chop and change, and then teams may qualify, teams may not qualify for the Olympics, and then the official team announcement then comes in right before the games, a couple of weeks before the games. And then sometimes there are surprises, and then you get appeals, so people can legally appeal.
Really cool.
Yeah, so it has to go to like a tribunal,
Oh,
essentially.
God.
Fuck's sake.
So you have to go through all that stuff, and then it might be, you might get picked out as an individual that shouldn't be on the sled because of X, Y, and Z, and that's got to go through this tribunal, and people have got to discuss it. It's
a stressful process.
Yeah, it's a crazy. It's super stressful.
Because all your eggs are in that basket. So
yeah.
yeah.
And people put so much into that. This is another issue with, Olympic sports. The Olympics in those sports is everything. Even though we have world championships every other year, European championships, you're on the World Cup representing your country, and you could be a full-time athlete, have UK sport funding, but not go to an Olympic Games. But still, everyone is so focused on going to the games. It's like they're everything. It becomes all-encompassing, and when people then don't make it, it's heartbreaking.
Was it like that for you? Was it all encompassing for you? Would you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember saying before Sochi, there was a load of appeals going on for our team specifically, and a big injury in our team as well. And this crazy rumor started flying around the camp that they would pull our team completely because it was so difficult within this appeals process and with the injury and replacing the injured athlete. So this weird rumor went around that we might get pulled from the Olympics. And at that point, I was like, our qualification process was so difficult. We qualified on the last possible day that we could qualify for the games. So I'd gone through this process. We qualified at the last minute, drove straight back to the UK, literally straight to Olympic kitting out, which is an incredible experience. You go to the Adidas factory, you're treated really well, and you get taken around, and you literally get fitted out in all of your Olympic kit. You get kicked out the back, and all of your suitcases are there with your name on them and the rings, and it's an amazing experience. So we've gone through all that. We go to the Olympic holding camp, and this rumour starts circulating that we might get pulled as a team because someone's got injured and there's difficulty replacing the injured athlete because of appeals going on. So I'm speaking to the sports psychologist about this, because at the time we had a sports psychologist in-house, and she was saying, what are you worried about, X, Y, and Z? And I said, well, because of this rumour, this could happen. And she tried to, I think, make it less important in my mind. She was like, well, you're just sliding down a hill on your bum, like no one's died.
Right. That's the wrong thing to say, isn't it?
For me, the way I think I described it to her, I think she said, why is it so important to you? And at the time I said, because it immortalizes me. I felt like just being able to achieve that and become an Olympian, I was immortalized somehow. And that's how important it was to me at the time. Yeah. In retrospect, I don't know if I feel the same, but it's easy for me to say now.
Because it's happened now.
Because I've done it. But that's how. In fact, I think there was a crazy statistic. Years ago, they did a questionnaire where they asked a load of people in an Olympic training venue, I think in the US. It was something about a drug that, if a drug was introduced or was available that was completely undetectable, guaranteed, and you would be guaranteed a gold medal in the next Olympics, but it would make you'd die before 50. I might have butchered that, but it was something along those lines. Yeah. I think more than 50% of the athletes said yes, they'd take it. That's how obsessed people get with it. It does get to the point where it's unhealthy, and I've known a lot of athletes that careers have been cut short because of injury, etc. And yeah, they've had real struggles mentally.
Do you think that's a necessary evil at that point, at that level of the game, as in to be the best of the best? Do you have to have that unhealthy obsession, do you think, or is it?
I think some people do and some people don't. I think there are some people that are so single-minded, they need to be completely immersed in the process to be the best that they can be. I've also seen those same people be the guys that get injured more, hurt more, have more mental health issues when things don't go their way. People that seem to have an outlet outside of the sport, a life outside of the sport, and can actually put two masks on, I think tend to get on better from what I've seen. There are always individual differences. There are the absolutely obsessive guys that master the sport and are the epitome of professionalism that do really, really well. But I think they're also put up on a pedestal, and they're what everybody sees. Like, we need to be that guy to be the best. But there are many others that live a very balanced life and are as successful, or maybe more successful, but they're not celebrated as much.
It's a weird. So obviously, when you talk about like the consummate professional, I think of someone like Johnny Wilkinson, who was kind of like became the GOAT of kicking in rugby union, and I think he's had quite a lot of issues around like anxiety, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but you know, because obviously, like you said, that was him. He was rugby union. It consumed him. But then you get other individuals like Gareth Bale springs to mind in football, who actually isn't really that arsed about football, and in his spare time he'd just go and play golf.
Yeah, maybe having an outlet works for some people, and
It's just individual, isn't it? Like, it's fascinating, I think, like sports psychology, and I think it's becoming more apparent now in like the 21st century how important that is to sport. It was overlooked for a while, but yeah, just how different people need different things. So like some people it needs to consume them, other people need that outlet.
Yeah, I think that might already be written before they even start sport. That might just be the
It's
way
just
you're wired.
imprinted in them. Yeah.
Like, if you're highly neurotic, you probably need to be that way. Whereas if you're more laid back, then you need outlets. I know people that it would drive them mad if they were as obsessed as like Johnny Wilkinson was. Whereas I know other people, and I was similar. If I didn't feel like I was putting everything into the pursuit, I felt like I was missing something, and that would itself give me anxiety. Where there was other people that could turn up and be very intuitive about whether they'd done enough, and then they'd kind of just go and relax and forget about it for the rest of the day. And
they can kind of detach.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But there's the famous example of supposedly before his gold medal 100 metre sprint at London 2012, Usain Bolt was just playing Xbox and eating chicken nuggets.
Yeah.
Supposedly. I don't know how much truth is in that, but
It's probably something along those lines.
yeah, as in like he could just switch off mentally, and then when he got to the start blocks, he's gone. He's in the zone.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think he's a really good example because, he didn't represent that really disciplined, neurotic athlete, as we've talked about others. He was somebody that was a lot more relaxed. He's obviously, probably the most talented specimen to ever do the sport. And I have found that with some of the more talented athletes in a speed and power sport. And it was interesting. I think there was a sprinter called Craig Pickering, who was an Olympic sprinter from Milton Keynes. He joined our team. He was the guy that got injured before Sochi.
Mm-hmm.
And Craig was very, very diligent with his training. He'd also done sports science in uni, very knowledgeable. And I'm certain he told me once that he thought that actually held him back a little bit more. That actually, if he'd have been slightly more lazy, like some of his competitors, he might not have got so much burnout, so much overuse injury, and a lot of his competitors didn't get as many injuries as he did. And I think in a speed and power sport, when you're very talented and your outputs are so high, the less is more approach can often work. And so some of the guys that are a little bit more relaxed around him, maybe they got on a bit better because they weren't overtraining.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Makes sense. It makes sense. So you said you're probably more in the sort of push 100% into it. That kind of makes sense. But do you think that detracts during those 5 or 6 years that you're kind of professional and that's your whole thing? Does that detract from other areas of your life in terms of relationships, family and stuff? I know Sonny Webster's talked about he didn't have any relationships along the way because he was like, well, they're always going to be second to this goal.
I would say so, yeah. I'd say that was definitely the case. If you've got somebody that's understanding, then that helps. But I think there's always going to be pressure. My family were really good. They knew that I was very single-minded. So even when they came out to see me compete at the games, for example, I said to them, look, if you're coming out to do this, I appreciate it, but I won't be on the phone to you all the time. I won't be coming to search for you. I need to be thinking about this because I didn't want the extra stress of my family being there. I didn't want to be worrying about them. I'm very, very single-minded when it came to competing. So it does detract, definitely. And the thing is, for me, the sport gave me so much. The social side of the sport, we were all down in Bath all summer. Where we lived was essentially like digs. It was a hostel at the back of a pub, and it was a lot of the athletes living there. So we were living with other athletes that did bobsleigh and skeleton, all going for the same goal. So it was great fun. We'd all go up and train. You'd have a great time training, doing what we love, bantering with the lads. We'd come back and eat, and then you'd have the evening around Bath. We'd go and wander around, just have fun, hang out. So my whole social life was involved around the sport as well, which I absolutely loved.
Sure.
So that was, it didn't detract from the social side of things, but yeah, I definitely spent a lot of time away from my family. It meant that, you know, anybody that I was with had to move down to Bath for the summer, for example, and everything had to be revolving around my life and my sport. And I think at the time I didn't realise, and it's something that I've come to realise now since I've retired, being a full-time athlete or an Olympic athlete is an incredibly selfish pursuit. You know, everyone says there's this thing about there's so much sacrifice, you've got to sacrifice so much. It's not a sacrifice, it's an absolute privilege. Being able to live just going for one goal and it just literally being yourself. Like having a team of people around you literally just keeping you together and trying to get the best performance out of you. Like, that's an absolute privilege. How many people to get to experience that in their life? And people say that's sacrifice. Like, I don't see it as sacrifice. I would say getting a normal 9-to-5 job would have been a sacrifice for me, definitely. So it's a very selfish pursuit, and you don't realize it at the time because of so many people saying, oh, you know, it's such a sacrifice, you work so hard. But it's incredibly selfish as a pursuit and as a life. And you don't really realize that until you come out of that bubble. And I've come to realize that now. I've come out of that bubble, that everybody who was close to me during that process, their whole life had to essentially mold around mine. And it was always my life, my pursuit, and no compromise. And that's always going to be hard for anybody that's trying to live or be with you or be part of your family.
I guess that's where the parallels with the military come back into.
Yeah, I was just thinking the same
you were
thing,
probably thinking
well,
the same
this is
thing.
why I asked the question, because we did an episode the other week which was like relationships within the military, and I was saying something kind of along the same lines, as in like certainly during training, like there's almost no time to have that extra 10% of your brain or whatever thinking about someone else, because, and I think, you know, like Marines training is difficult. It's probably not as all encompassing as all consuming as training to be an Olympic athlete. So I can only imagine the same thing is true. You can definitely see parallels in terms of, like you're saying, the way you live as well, like all with people doing the same thing. You're kind of insular in that environment. It's pretty similar. Maybe that's why people who are from the military do so well in that environment, because it's kind of similar.
Yeah, I think there's definitely an aspect of that, and it's something we learned really early on. I think we just presumed that a lot of the military presence was because of the ability to be able to go and do the sport, but there were other elements of it. It was the environment was so structured. You get smashed up down the track and you have to just follow orders, go back to the top and go again.
Yeah.
And just working as a team around like something like a sled. The sled has got to be maintained, put together, mechanics done on it. You've got to put it in the back of a vehicle. You've then got to take the vehicle up a mountain, sometimes in bad conditions. You've then all got to carry it off together. I mean, it's a quarter of a ton piece of kit. Like, you've got to work together to literally lug it around. A lot of the effort is lugging it up into the track. You've got to maintain it, get it onto the ice, flip it at the bottom of the track, make sure nothing gets damaged. Those are all elements that make it an easy transition for guys from the military to go in and start working in a cohesive group around that piece of equipment, which was much harder for civilians coming in. It was hard for me when I came in, but
Makes sense.
I learned so much, and I'm really thankful of that baptism of fire, so to speak, because I got given so much shit when I started, for good reason.
Yeah, of course.
But like, it definitely, without being too profound, it made a man out of me. I came into it as like just a lost student, and I really got whipped into shape.
Sort of matures you pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, I'm way better than I was, because I'm still not, the most organised person in the world, but like,
can relate to that.
Certainly, timekeeping, just working as a team, and all of that sort of stuff got a lot better coming into the sport. Just being efficient and taking responsibility for things.
Just going back to the actual vehicle then, because obviously that plays a big part in the actual sport itself. And I've read bits before about kind of British cycling and how much money they invested in the actual bikes themselves, the technology. Because the bobsleigh as an event doesn't have the same level as funding, to what extent are you kind of lumbered with like subpar equipment, so to speak?
So that literally depends on how much money is in the program and what the research and development is going on at the time. So like similar to British cycling, we had a big research and development side of the sport which didn't yield as much as it should have done. So you can buy bobsleighs from sled builders in specifically Germany and Latvia. They build very good sleds. A couple of specific sled builders build very good sleds out there, and you can get one off the shelf. So if you want the best 4-man bobsleigh in the world, you can get one off the shelf for I think about 120,000 euros, and it will be able to compete with the best sleds in the world. So there is an entry there to get the best sled in the world. In other nations, there is always some R&D going on, and these sleds can't be used by anyone else. The US have BMW, which created certainly incredible 2-man sleds. In Switzerland, they had the Citius program, which created some 2-man sleds and some 4-man sleds, which were world beaters, but then the technology has caught up with them. And in the UK, we partnered with McLaren initially, and McLaren built us a 4-man sled, which was pretty good for a first-time sled, but it was, I think, £250,000 project. Usually, you need a few prototypes before you get a really, really good sled. And everything was put into this one sled being built and being a world beater, and it wasn't, because they probably just needed another go at it. And there was just a couple of things. There were just a couple of practical elements that the science and all of the research and development that goes into it just can't account for. So when it actually starts being slid and ridden down a track, there are a few things that come up. For example, this McLaren sled was just a bit too stiff in its like structure, so it couldn't flex as well, and they think that's maybe what held it back. So in a straight line, it would have probably been the fastest sled in the world.
But round the track,
we've got a lot of corners to go around.
Yeah.
And then it was just like not so sensitive for the pilots through their hands, because you steer it with 2 like D-rings. So they feel a lot of like little vibrations and stuff through the D-rings. So it wasn't quite so sensitive. There was just a few little teething errors, which if they'd have had another stab at it would have been good. But they didn't have the chance to have another stab at it.
because the money had gone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how does that make you feel then? Obviously, as a professional athlete, you put your life and soul into this kind of one event, and then to a certain extent you might be held back by the actual sled itself. Like how do you begin to kind of, because for me that would be highly frustrating.
Yeah, so when I first came into the sport, it did frustrate me, because I thought I was looking at these other really brand new sleds from other nations, and I was thinking they're way better than what we've got. There is an element as a push athlete that sometimes I suppose you could resign yourself to the fact that you still have the start time to be proud of. So you get timed on the track. They always show the start time. So the total time from breaking the beam at 15 meters to crossing the finish line at the bottom, that's the total time that counts compared to everybody else. But what they will do is they'll time the 15 to 50 meter split, so the push start, and that will show up as well to see how good the push was, because the push start is so important. Like, you don't usually finish more than a couple of places away from the push start rank. The push start it's the most decisive part of the race.
Right, I was going to ask you that, as though if you actually break down the event, where is it won
so the
and
pilot
lost?
could make a massive error, or your kit could be terrible, and that will hold you back. But by and large, if you've got an experienced pilot, good kit, the start time is going to be the most important determining factor of actually where you place. So the start time always comes up, and it shows you a rank as well. So as a push athlete, you have a pride in your start time as well. So if the kit is not very good, and so the finish time isn't what it should be, you still have a bit of pride in your start time. But nobody gets medals for start time, so it's just a bit of personal pride. When I first came in, I was frustrated, thinking we've got old equipment, we're not going to be able to compete. But randomly, the one sled we had, which was a pretty old sled, there was just some soul to this sled. This sled was so quick. Like, it just would always have super high top speeds on the track, this sled. And there was all sorts of theories as to why it was. We couldn't understand why it was. It had a different frame. So a sled is made out of just like a car, really. You've got the chassis, and then you've got everything else around it. So the frame or the chassis, and then the carbon fiber is built around the outside. The cowling, as we called it. And this old frame, this old chassis, this steel frame, was slightly different to other frames, the more modern frames. And the story goes that there was an old sled builder in Germany, in Dresden, that used to build these frames out of a certain type of steel manufacture. And these sleds were all lined up in their factory, and the factory burnt down. So all that was left, all of the fiberglass had burnt away, but there was just these frames lined up. And this was one of the last frames that had been available, and a modern cowling, fiberglass cowling, had been built around this frame. So there was all these theories that it had been like heat treated because it had been in a big fire and all this sort of stuff. But some of the people in the sled, when we were actually competing, were younger than the age of the frame in that sled. But the frame seemed to be what made this sled really quick. So actually in 2017, we went to Whistler, Canada, and we won the World Cup race there, my team, in this sled. And we broke the speed record for a bobsleigh. So we set that we were first bobsleigh ever to go 97 miles per hour.
Fucking hell, 97.
We haven't even touched on the speeds that you hit doing this event. Like, that is mental,
obscene. So as a push athlete, your job obviously is to get it going as fast as possible. Then you jump in and you're just there for the ride. Then
essentially,
the pilot is just doing the bits, and you're
the pilot's steering it.
Hoping for the best.
What you've got to do is, a lot of the times hoping for the best, depending on how confident your pilot is at that track. There's a lot of aerodynamics and seating positions that go into what goes on in the sled. So your job isn't done, and I think that's where a lot of push athletes might slip up, is they concentrate so much on their push abilities but not being the best teammate they can be and getting in the best aerodynamic position, the most stable position, and allowing their teammates to kind of slot in around them. There's a lot of stuff that can go wrong when you're getting four big blokes into such a small area, with the spikes that you use have just got 300 needles on the bottom. It's called a brush spike. So I've got scars all down my legs from people cutting me.
Yeah,
even on my thumbs, actually, believe it or not. You see those there?
Oh yeah,
along the inside there.
Yeah.
One of my mates, he kept kicking my hand as he was getting in. Thanks, Andy.
So can you give us some examples of that then? You've got off to a good start, and you're now kind of like hurtling down this track. What do you actually have to do? So the pilot's obviously steering. How are you like leaning from side to side? Like, what are the intricacies of actually being aerodynamic?
You're trying to stay as stable as possible. All your head's in one line, so your heads can rattle about a lot. And if your heads are rattling about, it's affecting the airflow coming down the side. Your shoulders have got to be down. Which is creating
a bigger surface area, I'm guessing.
Yeah, and then you've got to be in the right. So there's got to be like a curve going over all of the helmets. So 3 needs to be lower than 2, and 4 needs to be lower than 3 and 4. And then you've got to like bury your helmet into the back of the guy in front of you so you don't get knocked out of place. But so much can go wrong. Like, you can get in, you can be sat on somebody's ankle. People can break their ankles and stuff because it's in between the frame and the 100-kilo guy sitting on you. And I usually used to be able to keep my wits about me quite a bit when I was competing. So if someone was sat on if I was sat on someone's foot or something and they got it in the wrong place, a couple of times I was able to like push myself up out the sled and then readjust them and stuff like that. Yeah. One of the funniest experiences, it was actually one of the most scary. So Whistler, the track I just mentioned, which we broke the world speed record. That's the fastest, probably scariest track in the world. We were there a few years ago doing 4-man. I was number 4. My friend was number 4. My friend was number 2. And then the other guy was number 3. Basically, number 3 slipped getting in. We're hurtling towards this corner, and what you're trying to do is someone slips, they're kind of like dangling on the side of the sled, and you've got to try and like pull them in anyway, and they can go in head first, just get them in the sled. Anyway, he slips off before we get to the corner. So I'm sat on the back, we're heading into this first corner, which is at big pressure, and I've like got nothing to lean against or anything. I'm like, what am I going to do here? The guy sat at 2 looks over his shoulder, and I'm thinking we need weight on the back of the sled here to kind of give it more stability. So I start like beckoning him backwards. So he starts getting up to move himself back into the seat of number 3, but then the first pressure hits and he just gets bent backwards like this, like he's lying in a coffin. At the same time, I get pushed forwards like this, and we're just helmet to helmet, just looking at each other, eye to eye, with him lying like this in the sled, which is a bad position to be in, because if you go over, you're just going to be smashed all up. So we basically did a 3-man all the way down the track in Whistler, and just looking into one another's eyes. It was
to go to like 95 mile an hour.
Yeah, and you just know there's a corner there called 50-50, because when they first opened the track, 50% of the sleds were crashing there. So we're just waiting for 50-50, waiting for it, and you just pray, and you're like, please, 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 please. And you get through that, and you're like, okay, we're almost there. And then you hit Thunderbird, which is one of the biggest pressures in the world. Like, literally, you'll almost lose control of your sphincter going around there. The vibrations and the freaking pressure, you're just holding on for dear life. And we're basically lying on top of one another, just our helmets getting pushed into one another, look into the whites of each other's eyes. So yeah, that was a scary moment.
Some good mental dexterity from you, going that fucking speed to go come back. The weight needs to be at the back here. Fuck it, that's some quick thinking.
Well, there's been other times where we've crashed. Twice this has happened to me. We've crashed and I've been sat at number 2 behind the pilot. Sometimes when you crash, one of the corners will just flip you back up onto your runners, so onto your blades, your skates. So we'd flip back onto our runners, so we're upright, and I have a look up, and then I notice the pilot still down like this, thinking that we're crashed. So I've had to reach over and tap him on the shoulder.
You're on again.
Looked right,
Back in, mate.
started driving again.
Fucking hell, that's insane.
So do you know the actual kind of like level of G-force that you're exposed to when you go down a track in relation to, I don't know, so like F1 drivers or something?
So I think when I was sliding, when I was competing, a couple of the bigger pressure corners had been taken out by that point. But we did do some testing. We got a gyro put into one of the sleds when we were doing McLaren were doing some research and development with us. And the gyro actually was put in the front of the sled where there's less G-force. So if you think of a whipping effect, it's like a 4-man sled. It's pretty long. It's like an estate vehicle. It's a lot of weight on the back. So if you like fly around a corner, or you're doing some drifting in like an estate rear-wheel drive estate vehicle, if you're in the driver's seat, you're going to feel less pressure than the guy that is like on the back. Like, you can understand that, right? Yeah. Just because of the centrifugal force and the whip that's being created around the corner. So the gyro was in the front of the sled rather than in the back. So it's going to be significantly higher in the back. But I think the gyro still read 6 Gs. And it wasn't even the biggest corners in the world. So we're probably experiencing upwards of 6 Gs momentarily. But then there's some, I think they did attach a G-force monitor, something to a skeleton slider's helmet once in Whistler. The problem is with skeleton, sometimes their chin like touches the ice when they're in a really big pressure, and the momentary G-force they were getting was ridiculous. It was like concussive every run. It was like an American football tackle, concussive G-force every run for skeleton athletes. Yeah.
So how much specific training do you actually do to condition yourself to that, or is it literally just time in the sled?
So neck training you can do to try and reduce your risk of, just rattling your brain. But honestly, nothing more than exposure helps. Like, every season I came back, I was always shocked by the G-force. So my first ever run down, I was like, what is this? Like, literally, I'm being buried into the bottom of the sled, and I can just see snot being pulled out of my nose like candlesticks, because the G-force is just pulling it out of my face. Yeah. And it feels like there's a fridge laying on my back. You can't breathe. So if you go into a G-force and you haven't taken a breath in, you're like, and you just can't pull your lungs out through the G-force. So every year we went back. By the end of the season, a run was just normal. G-force was normal. Every year we'd go back and we'd start at probably one of the milder tracks without much G-force. And every time I'd be like, damn, how did I put up with that for the whole season?
So exposure therapy throughout the season.
It never ceases to amaze me, because it's the same with, you've done some cold dipping, cold plunging, right? Yeah. Like, if you're ice bathing a lot, suddenly it becomes over time it becomes more tolerable. Yeah. You take a few days, a week off, you get back in, you're like, how did I ever do this for 4 minutes? Yeah, 30 seconds correct. In. And I don't know you can understand with cold water, but with G-force, there doesn't seem to be any evolutionary mechanism by which this would get easier for you.
Yeah, it's
But
true.
it just does. I think it's just exposure, the human body, whether it's just the fact that you're used to it, so it's not so novel every time you do it, but it does become more tolerable the more times you do it, for sure.
Yeah.
But the really some kind of primary care, so to speak, would just be neck strengthening to try and reduce your risk of rattling your head around too much, and also just being forced down into that position. Your neck just tightens up, and so you just get a bad neck. So it's good to strengthen your neck anyway.
Very true.
So yeah, I put a post on Instagram actually a couple of years ago now, because I'd had my headshot taken for the World Cup season one year. They take your headshot every year, and I'd done loads of specific neck training that year because my physio was big on. He'd come from American football, and he was big on reducing concussion. So we did a load of specific neck training, and my neck swelled, man. Yeah, my neck got so thick. It was
Went up a
mad.
few collar sizes.
Yeah, I was so surprised by how thick my neck got, and I was like, okay, cool. And then that was hopefully reducing my risk of concussion, but then probably at the same time increasing my risk of sleep apnea. So,
True.
so I was like,
It's
there's
a give and
rock in
take, innit?
Yeah, rocking a
Yeah.
hard place here. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier about how you were one of the lighter athletes. What weight did you compete at? What was your kind of body weight?
So I came into the sport when I first did a trial. I was 78 kilos,
Fucking hell. Okay.
and basically I put on 10k in 12 months.
I need your diet.
Yeah, you do. So he's kind of like high 70s, like your kind of fighting weight naturally, and then you had to kind of put on a lot of excess mass to compete.
It's hard to tell. I think I was still maturing, and I think I was kind of just staying relatively light because of just the amount of volume I was doing of running, because I was just training for like track and field at the time.
Right, yeah, of course.
And yeah, I think there was some natural maturation that was going on as well still. So I think under 80, I'm 6'1", under 80 is just ridiculous.
light, yeah.
Yeah, and I didn't really, because I was in those like long jump, triple jump circles at the time, sprinting circles, I didn't really feel light at all. But then I got into this sport and I was like, wow, like it's really unusual for someone to come in that light, really. But my speed and power ability was so high that I think they took a chance with me essentially, and I was able, luckily, to put on weight very, very quickly. So I put on the 10 kilos pretty quick. I think that did result in some injury issues, but then peak weight was 95, 96 kilos peak weight in my final year. So I put on 17, maybe 18 kilos over a 9-year career.
So you said 105 is about normal, is it? So you're still 10 kilos light.
I was still way under, yeah.
So does that, you think, help you out? Because you're saying obviously it's difficult sometimes to find the right position in the sled and all that kind of thing. If there's 4 big blokes in a sled but you're slightly smaller, is that an advantage in that team? Or
Yeah, it can be. So sometimes what you get is obviously 105 is the ideal weight, but only if every other guy in the sled is 105.
Yeah.
So then what happens is, if there are guys that are over 105, and there were a few, I was often paired with a guy, Toby, who's actually on Gladiators now. He's one of the Gladiators. I forget which Gladiator is. I should know this.
There's about 20 of them.
I think he's the one with the hood. Is it Phantom?
Right, I don't know.
Anyway, yeah, everybody watch out for Toby on Gladiators. Toby was like 115 to 118.
Oh, so you've like match
So,
made in heaven, basically.
Exactly. So me and him,
Each
like,
other up.
and I was in the sled with him when we broke that speed record.
Mm.
Like, we had some moments of brilliance together. We complemented each other, not even just through weight, but through our abilities as well. So I was often with him. I was a few times with a guy called Bruce Tasker as well, who Bruce was like probably around 110 a lot of the time. Bruce was a phenom as well, absolute phenom. So like that offset my lighter weight slightly too. But then there'd be other times when I wasn't with a big guy, and you always want to be competing with this sled and team up to weight. So you've got a maximum weight of sled and team. And this is something that actually in Cool Runnings, you remember John Candy, he'd lost a medal because he'd put weight in the sled. Well, that's allowed. You can put weight in the sled as long as it's not overweight. So I think the rule changed basically over the years sometime. So basically, if I was with other light people, we'd have to put extra weight in the sled. So you're pushing a heavier sled compared to everybody else. So then you're at a disadvantage with the start time. So that was the problem with me. I was underweight, and I would never have been 105. I just couldn't have moved well at 105. Like, I wasn't never meant to be 105 kilos body weight. But I was lucky enough that I could put enough weight on to be a force on the sled, and I was lucky that I had bigger guys around me to take up some of that slack essentially, so we didn't have to put too much ballast in the sled most of the time.
I guess it's a fine balance between kind of like, obviously mass moves mass, so you put on weight, it's beneficial, but then you don't want it to detract from your acceleration too much. So
exactly,
it's fine margins, isn't it?
That trade-off is a massive thing in the sport, because people come in and just want to put weight on, and if they do it too quickly, a lot of people, they can lose a lot of their speed and acceleration abilities. Some people not so much. It's actually surprising the amount of people that I saw get quicker while putting weight on, and I was one of these people. I think being like sub 80 or 80 kilos was never optimal for me, actually, when I got up more towards 90. And again, that might just have been maturation in my physical abilities as well, but everything went through the roof: speed, acceleration, strength, power, standing jumps, everything improved. I was way better at around 90 kilos. I felt that going above 93 kilos, there was a slight drop off. Yeah, but between
There's
88,
always that sort of diminishing
I felt like
returns,
that
isn't
was where it really dropped off. Between 88 and 92 was probably my ideal weight.
So you're very modest, Ben. So this needs airtime. So what if you can go through some of your like most impressive physical like performance metrics from your professional athlete?
Yeah,
years.
let's do a
Let's
roll call.
Yeah.
So probably my most impressive performance in anything that's measurable, I would say. I mean, the thing I was really best at was specifically pushing the side handle of a bobsleigh over 30 meters, but then nobody knows like what time is for doing that.
Yeah, true.
So, you know, speaking about things that people can relate to, standing long jump 358, 3 meters 58.
Fucking hell. Okay.
And that was like
Figure out what
feet.
that is.
A lot of people will jump with their feet over the edge of the pit,
Yeah.
a sand pit. Ours were actually on the edge, so it's from the flat. So 358. So that's about 358. What's the world record? I think it's now 374.
So you there or thereabouts? That's
mad, you know.
mental.
Far off.
That's not even your sport.
Yeah.
That's absurd.
For
Okay.
anybody that knows standing long jump, like that's still quite significant.
It's still quite a lot, but
like it doesn't look like a lot here. So that was probably my most significant. I was a very good accelerator, so anybody that's run like 30-meter sprints with timing gates. So usually when you do it with timing gates, laser gates, you stand, you know, about a meter away from the gate and break the beam and run through.
Sure.
But I ran 347 through those, which was, I mean, we had a guy in the team, Joel, who he's from Coventry, Joel. Yeah, he ran, I think, 342 through the gates. So I was only a few hundredths off him, but he was a sub 10 sprinter. So he ran 996 for the 100 meters.
Wow.
So
That's
over
mad.
30, like, and we had lots of sprinters, lots of top-notch sprinters that came into the sport, and I could do a lot of them over 30 meters.
And then your sort of top end speed wouldn't be maybe there.
Yeah,
so
no, they'd blast past me top end.
Yeah.
their
I said
top
going
end
back to
speed
you
is
saying,
incredible.
Bolt, he's known for his top end speed, but not necessarily his
It's
acceleration.
exactly.
So a lot of his kind of like world record sprints were like, he's not necessarily the fastest out the blocks, but then
he sort of overtakes
50 meters,
Yeah.
he's just cruising.
That was it. His top speed was his gift. And in track and field, that is the main factor in who wins. In the 100 meters, it's who reaches the highest top speed. So for me, that was never my biggest strength. It was acceleration. So I was in the right sport, especially in the position I was in on the sled. Lifting wise, 150 kilo power clean.
Yeah, that's mental.
160 bench and 200 ass to grass squat. I didn't squat a lot during my career, but early on I squatted and built up to 200 ass to grass. I only ever did it once.
And what body weight were you sat at when you did that?
To the 200, I was under 90 for the 200 ass to grass. I think it was 89k. I was
He did the same last week.
I was about 90 to 91 when I did the 150 power clean, and
That's
probably
fucking strong, that.
probably 90, 91 when I did the 160 as well. That seemed to be my best weight actually. Yeah, so the
90-ish.
160 bench was about 90 as well.
So
I'd love to do a two times body weight bench. Would be beautiful, but
Yeah,
that's a hard.
That's a
That's
big
great.
It's a
going.
hard go. That yeah.
Is it massively important, upper body strength for bobsleigh?
Some people argue it is. Some people argue it isn't. I thought it was. I always look at the human as you know an organism. So basically, I just don't think you can you should be dividing up upper strength, lower strength, upper strength. I think it all works as one. And I think if you get too lopsided one side to the other, it's never going to work.
True.
And the bench is just it's a demonstration of upper body strength, but it is really full body. It's still your central nervous system that is lifting that weight. But also for me, really, I think it is important because your contact point on the sled, your contact point on the thing that you're pushing and accelerating is through your arms. And so having stability and strength through there is important. And you're not bench pressing it off the line. You're just holding yourself pretty steady. But any leak up top is going to reduce your efficiency of how you're pushing the sled.
It is kind of like an isometric hold, effectively, right?
Exactly,
so it still requires...
Especially in that early hit. So when you hit the sled, especially on the side handle, the bar's there, and you just literally go bang, and you hit it in a bench press position.
So effectively is a explosive rep to fucking...
It is. So I think even just for that hit, it's important, because if you
that's just a key component of the actual event, though, isn't it? Like you said.
Yeah. I think it's important. I think it's a lot of people concentrate way more on the lower body, but I think the upper body is important for, especially for the hit on the sled, the initial hit. It's important, especially if you're trying to keep weight on, because if you're underweight and you need to maintain your weight or put on weight for the sport, there's a lot of weight that can be put on up top. Something that's developed more recently in the sport is the argument that actually, if you have guys with too much upper body weight, it's weight at the top of the sled, which gives it more of a kind of tipping ability, which isn't something you don't want. You want weight lower down in the sled.
True.
So some people say in the ideal bobsleigher would be someone with these huge legs and a tiny upper body, because all the weight's in the bottom of the sled near the track. But just how many people do you see with that body type that move quickly? Just not many. So
you're not stood up in the sled either. You're crouched in that position. So
exactly.
It's not that linear, right?
You're pulled right down.
Yeah, exactly.
But yeah, I think that the upper body strength is still important, definitely. But then I'd say that for all, I'd never want an uneven, lopsided athlete.
True.
Like even with people training for vertical jump, we still do bench press.
Yeah.
Just because I think it's an important thing to have. I think it gives you a lot of. It just improves the efficiency of your CNS to output at high force, and yeah, it's just something that balances you up if you're doing a lot of squatting. As long as you're not putting on excess weight if you're training specifically for vertical jump. But then if you keep the reps low,
you're just getting strength.
Yeah, and it's a potential. It has the ability to potentiate other things. So I'd often find doing a heavy bench or an upper body day can potentiate the day after without the associated fatigue of lower body training.
That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So it's like my potentiation or activation methods changed a lot over the years. Like sometimes you can go in and do a heavy bench press the day before doing like lower body explosive work, and you can find like a weird potentiation effect from that. Because if you'd have gone in and people were like, well, I'll do some explosive squats instead because it's going to be specific to the musculature I'm going to use. But then you can also fatigue in them. Yeah.
Well, I think based on that conversation, it's quite evident that you know what you're on about, Ben. So maybe now if we transition more into kind of what you've moved into now in your life after being a bobsledder and your coaching. So kind of, have you always had an interest in coaching? Because obviously you were doing your masters in, was it sports science in Wales before you actually then became an athlete?
Yeah.
So is it always something, was that the plan originally, or so do you want to just talk us through that?
So I was always interested in improving my own performance, which got me interested in training theory. I didn't really think beyond my own performance. When I was younger, I wasn't thinking about what I wanted to be when I was older, what my career would be, whether I'd make any money. I just knew I was interested in training and human performance and improving my own performance. So, I did PE at A level, and that was my best subject. I was lucky enough where I was based in Shropshire, there was an Olympic coach up the road who actually created a coaching centre in his back garden. So Dennis has now been to 5 Olympic Games, I think, as a coach. So I was obviously just learning loads from Dennis as well from about 16 onwards.
So how do you go about accumulating an Olympic setup in your back garden? Because I've got some strongman tyres here, and I think I've done pretty well with myself, but it's not an Olympic setup.
Yeah, so it's a funny story. indoor arena that used to get used for indoor athletics in the UK was at RAF Cosford, not far from here, and they had it in an aircraft hangar. And for whatever reason, the RAF decided to rip that out of the hangar. And Dennis used to coach athletes there, and he said, well, what are you doing with the track surface? And they said, well, nothing. So he was like, can I have it? And yeah, next thing he did was concrete his back garden, and he set up a 50-meter sprint, a long jump pit, high jump pit, and he had a garage with his weights in as well. And he even hollowed out the takeoff areas where we'd be jumping from, and would put a pallet and some MDF there to dampen the impact on our jump takeoffs. So it was all very well thought out. So I was influenced by obviously somebody with that kind of coaching obsession from a young age, and then essentially it was just a natural course of things that I was well into sport. I wanted to continue doing sport at uni and keep competing, and you tend to do that by going to a sporting university and studying sports science, which is exactly what I did. I will admit I wasn't ever the best student, but I learned a lot from people around me and learned a lot from doing. So being in Cardiff, when I went down to Cardiff, there was a national indoor arena actually on campus. So I had the training centre on campus. There were loads of great coaches there, loads of international athletes that I was training with. So I was literally just sponging information off everybody, training hard, learning. I was on online forums all day, learning about, training theory, and still trying to do my degree. So I'd, go to lectures and go through the motions, but then get straight back into the training arena and train with everybody and just learn from everybody around me, really. And yeah, I think at that point, I suppose, as I was getting into my masters after that, and the reason I did my masters was just to continue training and continue learning from everybody around me, really. I wasn't so bothered about having the qualification as I was just learning about this subject I was really interested in. And at that point, getting an unpaid internship at a national governing body or a professional sports team would have been a dream coming out of university with a masters, which when you think about it now is crazy. But we're in a completely different time now with social media, and it is a bit of a golden age for professionals in the fitness industry or in strength conditioning, because it gives you a lot of freedom to build your own brand and build your own self-employed business, which is something that would have been very, very difficult in the past unless you were going into gym ownership, for example. Mm-hmm. So there are good things and bad things about social media now, especially in this sphere, in the sphere that we're talking about, in training theory. Because there's a lot of misinformation out there now, and there's too much information for people as well, and currency isn't necessarily truth or experience anymore. It's more views and clicks. But in the same vein, it's still given S&C coaches and fitness professionals, by and large, way more ability to earn money and way more freedom in what they're doing. So I really fell into this, and the coaching side was forced to set up the online business because of a lack of funding after 2019. And then I always knew after that point that I wanted to start working with people in person, because so many people were interested in the informative posts that I was putting out, because that's how the whole growing an Instagram brand started. Was initially me just showing myself training and jumping on things because people sort of thought it was impressive.
It is.
And then people wanted to know, well, how do I do that? And I would go into some of the theory behind it, and that's how this whole thing grew. Then the loss of funding forced me to set up the online business, because I needed something that I could do while I was away and something that was remote. Mm-hmm. Then luckily as well, when we were funded, we used to get grants to do different educational courses. So I was, building up my knowledge as a therapist, for example. I took sports massage courses, sports acupuncture courses. And yeah, that all led towards me going into coaching, essentially, because then when I retired, I started working with more people in person.
So those are, the people you're working with in person are athletes? Are they Gen Pop? What's the crack?
So yeah, complete range of different people, which has been amazing, but I suppose is the pull of social media and the amount of people that can view what you're doing. So I've worked with people from ultimate frisbee to dodgeball to trick kayaking to Olympic swimmers, lots of bobsleigh and skeleton athletes, track and field athletes, professional footballers, rugby players. So yeah, the spectrum is ridiculous.
Yeah. And that's just by virtue of having a big reach, do you think, on social media? Is that a little bit of your credibility as an athlete as well?
I think it's a little bit of both. Obviously, the reach is a big thing, but the credibility factor is definitely playing a role, because there are lots and lots of people with big reaches on social media. But I think people trust the fact that I've done it at a high level. I can demonstrate it, and there is actually some formal education behind what I'm saying, which I suppose gives some credibility within the online space.
Something I was going to ask you was, do you think that someone needs to be an athlete or a decent level of have a decent level of athletic ability to be a good coach, or do you not think that correlation needs to be there?
That's an age-old question, isn't it?
It is,
it's
yeah.
like, because you can only teach from a place that you've been yourself almost.
Exactly, yeah.
That's a good question. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that there are many great coaches. In fact, thinking about it, yeah, maybe the greatest, certainly track and field coaches in the world didn't compete at a high level. So Dan Paff, for example, he's often touted as maybe the greatest track and field coach in the world. And I don't know what Dan's training history even is. He was a school teacher that was obviously, I think, told to coach many of the different sports teams in his school, but he was a scientist and a very, very intelligent fella, and then started applying that specifically to track and field, ended up working in one of the big American colleges and became maybe one of the greatest track and field coaches in the world, but probably the best or most influential coach as far as training theory goes. And he wasn't a top athlete. I think being a top athlete can create biases as well because of what worked for you, rather than you being outside and observing what works for everybody.
True.
It probably gives you a head start. I think it definitely gives you a head start. So I would say, without blowing my own trumpet, I think my coaching eye is probably further ahead than it would be for another budding coach that hadn't done a speed sport to a high level already.
Yeah.
Because I've been watching, another advantage of being with a experienced coach from a young age. I was watching fluid movement, even just audible feedback from ground contacts from 16 years old became a bit of an obsession, and you'd see the feedback and cues that the coach would give to other athletes, and you just learn, right?
Yeah.
Just learn. If you're in that environment, you just learn. And so I think my ability to see things when people are moving is probably further along than it would be if I'd have started this from scratch and not competed at a high level.
Yeah.
So I think it definitely gives you a head start, but at the same time it can be a disadvantage in that you might have biases coming in, and sometimes there can be maybe a bit of overconfidence or slight arrogance, I think, from people that have competed at a high level, because they already presume that most people that have competed at a high level basically have a PhD in their sport, but it's from their own lens and it's what they experienced. To roll that out to a bunch of other individuals that don't move, don't think like you, that need to be communicated to, then suddenly that, like, if you've got no communication skills,
True.
or you don't have empathy, which a lot of athletes don't have.
Yeah, it's like it's a tool in your toolkit, in it, being a professional athlete, having spent time around phenomenal coaches, being coached. I think if you're in that environment but you're cerebral enough to take it all in and be like, okay, well, why is he telling this person this to get this adaptation out of him? If you're thinking about it, I think it can be a massive advantage. If you're just ignoring it all and thinking, well, this is what worked for me, this is what's going to work for you, it's probably that obviously doesn't work. So I think it is individual, and it needs the right sort of mindset around it to create that as an advantage, whereas sometimes it could be a disadvantage, I think.
Yeah, I think definitely some athletes are more involved than others in the theory side of things and how obsessed they are with it. What I will say is, though, by and large, even the guys that I competed with or trained with who I thought, probably didn't take so much on and were a bit more simplistic in their thought processes, when I've seen them now giving people feedback when somebody new turns up or they do their own coaching, I'm like, oh wow, you were just thinking exactly the same way I was. Like, they can articulate very well what somebody needs to do, or give them a little tip or a little cue that works really well to get them in the right position. So I do think also it is a trend in successful athletes that they tend to be able to translate what coaches are telling them, or what movement needs to happen, into their own language, or their own in their own head. And that then comes out the other side when they're teaching people, and you suddenly you think, oh, that's a really good cue, or that's a really good
that's
idea.
very true.
So I think even though they might not be sharing it on the outside, anybody that's successful at a high level has a very in-depth understanding, certainly of their own movement and their own reaction to things.
Because that can sometimes be a downfall of an out-and-out, like, highly educated coach. Is sometimes they can make it far too complicated for someone to actually take on.
Absolutely. And yeah, that's very, very true. And that's why lecturers and sports scientists, even with all their knowledge, probably aren't the best coaches.
Yeah,
it
true.
might be people even without a sports science background, and you get a lot of coaches that do that, because coaching is very different to just the theory. Humans are so complicated. There's such a massive social element, and just like
Very true,
skill acquisition and being able to actually talk to people. And yeah, that's a massive part of it. Like, if you're just all about numbers, like, one thing that's really frustrated me about some coaching in the past has been clock watching. And what I talk about clock watching is, like, if the timing gates are on and you're running, if a coach is looking at the clock and not looking at you moving, I'm like, that's not coaching.
Yeah,
You're a sports scientist running a session.
Yeah,
like, you may as
true.
well be in a lab doing testing here for somebody's PhD.
Yeah.
So yeah, coaching is very, very different from just the theory side of it. And coaches, by and large, generalists, so they need to know a bit about a lot of things, rather than just being really in depth on one thing. That's why you have physiologists, biomechanists, S&C coaches in a team. But usually their head coach is somebody that has a good knowledge of all of those different things.
Yeah.
Because if you give an athlete to just one of those people, then they just overload them with their level of their area of expertise, their biases, and then they miss out on all the other areas. So the coach is often the person that's having to spin all the plates and control a team of people as well.
So, in your own experience, what difficulties have you run into doing online coaching in actually being able to coach people? Because a lot of online coaches are working with kind of Gen Pop, and they're working towards, I don't know, fat loss goals or aesthetic goals, which is still hard to convey remotely if you're not doing in-person or PT. But if you're then trying to teach someone like sprint mechanics, how do you do that over like a Zoom call?
Yeah, so it's way more difficult than in person, and that you get way more feedback when you're actually with somebody. But we are in an age where, you know, video and connectivity is so good that you can do quite a bit online. So you can actually do live sessions when someone literally sets their camera up, and you can give them feedback if they've got their AirPods in. And I do this quite a lot as well. I literally do live sessions with people on the other side of the world. With sprinting, it's difficult because of the shot. The ideal thing that I've had is when they've got somebody with them and the person that's with them literally films them as they're doing it. But that's difficult for a lot of people because that person with you has got to take time out to actually film. But I've definitely had that experience with some high school athletes in the US. Like, their parent, it will usually be one of their parents that will reach out to get the coach in, and then I'll say, well, we'll set up this weekly session, go to the track, take the camera, AirPods in, or the parent will hear me and give the feedback.
So you're like one of those apps, you know, like Umbro used to do an app where you'd be running and it tells you about your ground contacts and says like slow down, speed up, whatever. Yeah. You're like in the ear saying that's class. What I do, which is kind of, I guess, the same sort of thing, but I do it all via video, so it'd be like a Zoom call. They've videoed something ahead of time, sent it me, and we go through frame by frame when I share the screen. So I think that's the way I've found to get around it. I've never had someone actually have like a live session, which is kind of a cool idea, I think.
Yeah, so I think that works especially for speed, but for by and large, if I'm running a whole program with somebody, a lot of that comes back to the video feedback.
It's analysis, right?
So it's similar to what you're doing. Cool. So my athletes are on Team Builder, so they can upload their videos to their Team Builder training journal. So I log in every day. I'm getting notifications of people uploading video, and I'll log in, look at video. If there's feedback that's needed straight away, that goes onto the video. So the writing goes onto the video. And then with the weekly check-in calls, we'll go through the feedback at the time. And if they need demos, so I'm usually in the gym when I do the check-in calls as well.
Okay.
So if they need demos, I kind of jump up from the camera, grab a bar, or demonstrate the position for them.
So they can see it in,
They see it in real time, yeah. So the feedback is often there in the journal, so they can go back and note what they need to do technically during that session. It's way harder, and this is where the online stuff is more difficult. It's way harder to demonstrate that for the athlete and make sure that they understand what you're saying.
Yeah,
so
true.
being able to talk to someone in time and say, oh, you need to get your hips through more, and then just demonstrate it. Boom, they've got it. Next rep, they do it. Whereas online, you watch a video, you write, you need to get your hips through. They might not understand what that means.
Yeah.
So then you have to get on a call and demonstrate it. But that's where the training journal, feedback on the training journal, and then weekly check-in comes in from me.
Yeah.
So that's it's never going to replace in-person training. But then I always offer this for my guys. If they're in the country or they're near me, they can come and do in-person sessions as well.
Yeah, and that's valuable. That's
honestly been the best, I think, the best training approach I've had with people is people that can come for short periods, for single sessions, even for training camps. So yeah, some of my footballers especially, you know, in season or when they're with the club, they can't come and see me.
Yeah.
But come summer in the off season, they'll often do 1-2 week camp, sometimes a longer camp. If they're based in Sheffield, I've had guys that play at other clubs down south, but then they're based in Sheffield. That's where they're from originally. So come summer, they come in and they'll spend the whole summer training period with me, so I can actually get some proper work in with them.
So you probably make massive strides in those in-person sessions that you just don't make online, right? So you see someone in person, and it's like you've had 8 online check-ins, you know, in that hour.
Absolutely, yeah. And
So
there's just
valuable.
there isn't any way around that.
No,
and
no.
the thing is,
that's
I'm not like
true.
we're in the online training sphere.
Mm.
Like, there's no. I'm not talking down online training, obviously, because it's still better than 90% of what people are getting anyway.
True.
But being able to do those in-person sessions are great.
It's probably a really good hybrid between the two, isn't it?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
we found that with the seminars that we
Yeah,
put
very
on.
true, yeah.
So a lot of guys would come down and just like half an hour with us, like hands-on, in-person demos, and they're like, oh, I can do a pull-up now.
Yeah,
and it's
exactly.
like, mad.
Yeah, it's that's one of the kind of reasons like we wanted to put them on in it, because we see a lot of people online, and like you say, it's hard to demonstrate, hard to get that across. Whereas you see them in person, it's just like that, isn't it? You can sort of troubleshoot things straight away.
Absolutely, yeah. The video check-ins do help online, I find.
100%.
But yeah, being able to work with someone in person is great. The only issue is with that as well, I think, you know, successful coaches out there, they have a large group of people. Running an individual session with somebody like PTs do is very, very difficult, because for people training for like Olympic sport or for professional sport, your training session is going to last longer than just an hour.
Yeah.
The warm-up's an hour.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And like
Body
as a
work.
coach, like
Yeah.
you're not very well. It's not a good use of your time just having one person.
It's not
at a time.
scalable, is it? For one person for 3 hours, it's like...
It isn't, not at all. And so, you know, you've usually got a big group of people, so it's actually very rare that unless the athlete has the resources, that you're going to be doing a proper training camp or 3-hour training sessions at a time just with one athlete.
Yeah.
Now, I have been able to do that with like my Premier League footballers, because
Makes
they have
sense.
the resources to do that.
Yeah.
Whereas with other people, that's very difficult, so you need to get more people in the group. And then you may miss things, unless you've got an assistant coach. So then in that case, actually some of those individual check-ins and looking through people's training journals, you can get a pretty individualized approach to those
True.
people.
That sort of brings us on to your plans for the new year. So that you're looking at doing some sort of workshop / seminar stuff yourself, right? So talk me through what would go on in a workshop, and then sort of what your plan is for those.
Absolutely. So I've been wanting to run more workshops for a while.
Mm-hmm.
I've run a couple before. I did a couple last year in North America. And every year I do essentially workshops for the university as well. So Sheffield Hallam University for the sports science and the strength and conditioning master students. I usually do a couple of sessions. I'll do an acceleration-based session and a top speed-based session. Within that, we'll talk about mechanics of each. We'll talk about training approaches, and we'll talk about strength conditioning approaches relating to each one. So I essentially want to turn that into a workshop that I could, which is part theory, part practical, that I could present at different gyms all over the place. So hoping in the spring of 2024 to be in North America, Canada and the US, to do a bit of a tour around there. And then later in the year, I'm definitely going to be in Greece in September. And then, I'd really like to go down under at some point as well, but that's going to take a bit longer to plan in advance.
Awesome. Sounds cool. So are they day events? Are they like a couple of hours? What are you thinking?
They should be day events. So I'll have to set up the theory side of things. So we'll look more in depth into periodization, training theory, strength conditioning, and application to different sports as well. But they'll be heavily based on explosive training, jumps, acceleration, and top speed. Yeah. Maybe some change of direction as well.
That sort of exposure, I think, even in, like you say, groups, sometimes it can be a little bit diluted, can't it? But that exposure to someone like yourself with the breadth of knowledge you've got in maybe a 1 to 20 or whatever it is, 1 to 30 environment is still super valuable, because they're having that ability live to think, fucking hell, I've got a question, I can ask and get that squared away right then and there. So it's a massive, and that's, again, why we started to do a similar sort of thing with the seminars, but it's a really valuable thing to offer, and the fact that you can do it pretty much worldwide is phenomenal. So
yeah, definitely, I'm excited to embark on that journey, and I think there are a lot of elements that I think the running mechanic side of things can probably stretch across a lot more, many more sports.
Yeah, definitely.
And even into the functional fitness area, and just reduction in overuse injury and improvements in efficiency. Running efficiency is going to help almost all athletes. So I want to start putting that into practice as well. And putting those workshops or seminars on in many different places. So that's going to be the plan really for 2024.
Awesome.
Perfect then. Right, so before we finish, Ben, how can people get in contact with you? How can they find you on the internet?
So main place, Instagram, Ben the Bounce, one word, and then across other platforms I'm also Ben the Bounce, so TikTok, YouTube, and then my coaching page on Instagram is Semtex_systems,
which is a great name, by the way.
Yeah, we said that before you came.
Yeah.
Actually, Semtex Systems is a great name.
Good branding. I love it. So it was always going to be that, and I've got some branded clothing as well, and I've kind of come away from that side, but I need to build it up again in the new year. It's kind of mad because Ben the Bounce grew so much on Instagram.
You kind of now can't leave that name almost, because it's like it's got its own meaning behind it.
Yeah, it's tough, and it's like a lot of people. Initially, I was always, just associated with the Semtex Systems brand because that is my coaching company. But then at that point, it was like I probably only had twice the followers that the Semtex Systems page had, so they were just more closely linked. And then Ben the Bounce went right up into the stratosphere, and I kind of let Semtex do its thing as I was launching the Vertical Project, which is something that I launched last year, which is all through the Ben the Bounce brand.
Awesome.
But yeah, highly encourage you guys to go and check it out, because there's some absolutely unbelievable like jump reels and stuff. Like, it's mind-boggling how elastic you are effectively.
It's very true. But also, that sort of niche of knowledge as well with speed and power is not something you find on it. No. So on Instagram and TikTok, there's fucking a million coaches talking about how to improve strength, how to lose fat, certainly. There's pretty much no one who does it to the same degree as Ben anyway, who talks about how to improve speed and power, and from the same sort of level of credibility that you've got. So definitely go check him out. And thank you for coming on, Ben.
No problem, been a pleasure. Thank you.
Cheers.